Hello and welcome in psychology students. Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to our short lecture on the social development of teens, or also known as adolescence. So we're going to take a look at teens, and really what we're going to focus on is the identity development of teens. So first of all, when we think of adolescence, typically the teen years, it is this major transition period from childhood to adulthood. So this is one of those awkward stages that we all go through where you're not quite a child anymore, but you're not quite adult status. So it's often pretty stressful for people, and it's one of our tougher developmental stages. Classically, it's been referred to as storm and stress, coined by the famous G. Stanley Hall. The reason we think about adolescence as stormy and stressful is because it's characterized by moodiness or the emotionality of teens. It's a time of conflict with parents, which, I can personally relate to. When I was a teen, I had issues with my parents at times. But we also know it's a time that's classic for risky type behavior, whether it's unprotected sexual practices, experimentation with drugs and alcohol. We know that eating disorders pop up during this time, reckless driving, the list goes on and on. So it's a tough period where we're really experimenting with things and possibly are not quite thinking about the consequences of our behavior, and thus we often think of teens as risk takers. However, what we're going to focus on here with adolescence is identity development. So this was really sort of focused on by the very famous Erikson. By studying different cultures, he found that identity development typically happens during this time of our life. And so we would expect teens to go through what we call an identity crisis, which sounds horrible, but in this case, we're saying it's normal. This is where the adolescent is concerned with decisions about their future and the quest for self-understanding. So in other words, this is where the teenager is dealing with the swirl of different ideas and responsibility and are trying to answer the question, who am I, or who will I be? So that's really kind of what we're focusing on. So we're going to take a look at some research which was developed by James Marcia, once again building on Erikson's theory. Once again, the goal of adolescence, or at least one of them, is to attain what we call a mature identity, to get a sense of who you are as a person. And so Marcia, borrowing from Erikson, believed two things have to happen in order to obtain that status. First of all, the teen has to undergo exploration of options. In other words, what we mean by that is they're experimenting, they're sampling the world. The way I kind of think of it is the teen is trying on different identity hats to see which one fits the best. So this is the sort of process we go through as a person where we're sampling the world and seeing what the world has to offer. At some point, we would also have to come to a decision or commitment. In other words, invest ourselves in our decision regarding identity. So in number one here, you would be exploring and experimenting, but number two, at some point you would have to say, okay, this is the one that I like the best. For example, as a musician, I really think about music as an identity, so I'm going to use that as an example here. A lot of people identify with a musical genre. So number one would be where you're listening to all the different types of music, whether it's rap or rock or classical, you're sampling the different genres. But then at number two, you sort of figure out which ones you like best, and therefore those are the ones that you probably like to listen to and identify with most. So that's kind of what we mean with identity, is that to figure out who you are as a person, you would have to do the research and the groundwork to sample and explore, but you would also at some point have to commit and live your life accordingly. So based on that notion, these two questions, it's basically either a yes or no kind of thing. That would lead to 4 potential conditions or statuses in terms of identity. So our first one here, we'll start with the worst case scenario. Marcia called identity diffusion. By the way, Erikson called this identity confusion. In this particular case, what we're saying is that the teen has not explored their options, and number two, has not come to a decision or commitment. So it's a double no, basically. In other words, they haven't looked at what's out there, and they haven't even bothered to decide to make a decision or to commit to anything. So it's sort of like they have no sense of identity. They're sort of confused. It's diffused, if you would, and therefore it's uncertain in terms of who they are as a person. Our second condition is called identity foreclosure. What this basically means in terms of the two questions here is, number one, they have not explored, but number two, they have committed. So the problem here is that they've committed without actually doing the groundwork. They haven't explored their options. So one of our most famous examples of this, the one that Erikson himself used, was of course the Hitler Youth. So if you guys know your World War II history, these young impressionable boys in Germany during the time of World War II and leading up to that were incorporated into the military. So this is sort of like the Nazi Boy Scouts, if you would, where these young boys were assigned an identity by the military regime. In other words, Hitler was basically grooming the youth of his society to be mini soldiers. So what we're saying here is that these kids who were in the middle of this condition obviously made a huge commitment. So they were taught the lore of being Nazi and that whole lifestyle. But the problem is they never really got to decide it for themselves. So in other words, they didn't get a chance to sample or to explore. The point is that after the war and after these kids became adults, they probably would have been unhappy with that decision. In other words, this was sort of forced on them, and they didn't get a chance to decide for themselves. So sometimes when in people's life, we make decisions too early, we're too rash, or people influence us to do that, like our parents, and we don't get to figure it out for ourselves, and that can lead to regret later on, and that's why we're saying it's not quite a mature identity. Obviously, at some point, you're going to have to decide it for yourself and figure it out. Our third one is called identity moratorium. Moratorium literally means a suspension of activity. So in this particular case, what we're saying is that the person has explored and experimented, but they have not committed. They've delayed the decision of deciding who they are. When I think of this one, I go back to my college years, and some of my friends in college, I had noticed basically never graduated. In other words, they were what we call professional college students, where they would stay in the college arena, maybe possibly switching majors from time to time, but at some point they never really decided what they were going to be, in terms of their career or their identity. So in other words, this shows uncertainty. It shows that they're not really willing to commit, they're not really sure who they are, and thus they're sort of stuck in the experimentation process. Well, once again, as a mature adult, at some point you're going to have to decide what you're going to do or who you're going to be as a person. So it's just sort of showing that they're not quite certain. All right, our last one would be identity achievement. So you can kind of see where we're going with this. Number one, they've explored. Number two, they've decided and committed. So Erikson and James Marcia believe that this is essential to becoming, an efficient adult, and a mature adult is understanding who you are. And so as an example, this would be where, let's say, we're focusing on political ideology, which a lot of people relate to. So if you're trying to figure out which political realm or flavor, I guess you could say, that you're investing in, this is where you're looking at all the different parties, Democrat, Republican, et cetera, and then you've actually decided that this is the one I like the best, and this is the one I'm going to go with. This is how I'm going to vote. This is how I'm going to live my life. So in other words, it's just basically showing that they've done the research, they've explored, but they have also committed to one particular area, and they've invested themselves in it. So that's what we would kind of expect at some point, is the person to sort of commit to those options. All right, so make sure you know those different identity statuses, if you will, in terms of those two questions. So I've put this following graph here, or chart, excuse me, on our Canvas page to help you kind of study that. So make sure you're able to identify those different statuses with those decisions and exploration pieces that we've just talked about. Okay, so this will conclude our short lecture here on identity and adolescence, and please go on to the next step.